Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for South and Southeast Asia, Chapter 25, Section 1, the British in India. And to begin with, we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of terms, and these terms are going to come back to haunt us several times in the next few weeks. We're going to talk about colonialism and how that differs from nationalism. And colonialism is the practice of gaining lands and establishing colonies. In other words, the whole concept of developing like an empire. And the British were kind of known for wanting to establish colonies. Obviously, here in the Americas, we were part of the colony system that the British had. As a matter of fact, there was an old saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire. But it seems that at different times there were peoples that were trying to gain their independence from the hands of the British. And that brings about this thing called nationalism, pride in one's country or pride in one's people. And as we talk about South Asia, we have to talk about the emergence of different nations that's going to come out of what is the subcontinent. Predominantly Pakistan and India are two of those nations that were once part of the British Empire that were able to gain their independence through a lot of protesting and politicking, if you want to call it that. And at some point in time, and I'm going to flip here so you can see this map. The British, and not only them, but if you look at parts of Southeast Asia, you had the French in what would be Vietnam or French Indochina, which I'm running my cursor over right now, or the Dutch, which would be down in the area of what is present-day Indonesia. But this pink colored area, this is territory that was pretty much in the hands of the British. And you can look at India and what would be Pakistan and parts of Burma and Thailand. But if you look further off to the west here or to your left, you'll see a good part of the Middle East and parts of Africa. So the British certainly had a lot of territory and they had a huge influence. But this is one area where some of the fighting for independence is going to start fairly early on. So, number one, European imperialism in Asia and Africa was made possible for two following reasons. The Industrial Revolution, which kind of began during the 1700s and introduced new technologies that increased European military advantage over the rest of the world. They had great weapons. Along with that, great empires of Asia and Africa all had severe internal problems at this point in time. And it was at a time that Europeans' power was rising, and with this military advantage, certainly this gave countries like Great Britain an opportunity to really stake hold of territory elsewhere in the world. So, in number two, the process of one people ruling or controlling another is called imperialism. Imperialism and colonization or colonialism really do kind of go hand in hand. Europeans did not try to control Africa and Asia earlier because they did lack the technology to compete with the empires of Asia and North Africa. But as the Industrial Revolution comes around, weaponry becomes easy to produce and it becomes more accurate. And so, what would have been very difficult to gain as far as territory with old conventional weapons becomes much easier with things that are a little more on the line of sophisticated weaponry. In India, the British East India Company played a role in British imperialism because it controlled trade between Britain, India, and Asia, East Asia, and ruled in India in the name of Great Britain. What's interesting is when the United States declares its independence in the 1700s, uh, one of the things that the British was losing out on is kind of its ability to get cotton and tobacco and some of the prized products that were coming out of the Americas. And India was also a cotton producer. And so, about the time that the United States is kind of breaking away, the British kind of really take a foothold in India. And part of that is because of the work of the British East India Company. The British always had a policy of British mercantilism, which basically the people that they ruled over had to buy products that were taxed by the British. In other words, companies like the British East India Company kind of had a monopoly when it came to certain products that you would buy when you went to a store or when you wanted to buy groceries or things of that nature. The British East India Company made changes to India, which included establishing an educational system and establishing the English language. They also banned the practice of sati. And I've got to explain what this basically means. And it's something that used to happen with the Hindi people, the people who were Hindus. But let's say a man who was married passes away. His wife, during this man's funeral, and typically when we talk about Hinduism, they don't typically bury their dead, they cremate. And so when the body of the husband is being cremated, the woman would throw herself onto the fire and kill herself as well. That is the practice of sati. And it was kind of gory, and it was a little dramatic. And the British obviously were probably very appalled when they saw that. And so they worked very hard to put laws into place that would keep women from doing that. They also were involved in spreading the Christian faith in this part of the world. Indian soldiers who fought for the British Army were called sepoys. In 1857, there was something known as the Sepoy Mutiny. And it has everything to do with some new weaponry that the British were producing. The British introduced a new rifle, and to lubricate the rifle, they use grease from animals, and they use pork fat and beef fat. Well, depending upon your religion in parts of South Asia, you could be offending multiple religions at the same time. We've got to remember, if you're a Muslim, pork is considered to be something that you abstain from. It's dirty. They don't want to have any contact with that. And if you're greasing a gun, a soldier has to grease their gun with this fat. I mean, that obviously would be kind of in violation of their faith. If you're a Hindu, beef fat is kind of the same idea. It would be a taboo for them to touch it and to come in contact with it, and hence now they're going to be using it to grease their guns. So this was an insult to the soldiers who were Hindu and Muslims. In the end, the British Crown took control of India as a result of this mutiny, and India now is part of the empire, the British Empire, as a result of this. So life under British rule was a life of segregation and also few opportunities for Indians to participate in the government. For the most part, a very small minority of white British citizens were running the government, and the majority of the people that they governed were powerless. So as a result, Indian nationalism, this pride that people have in their country, it's kind of like patriotism, it grew. And boycotts started. So people were, trying to boycott British goods, anything that they could do to protest what the British were doing. The term for British rule in India was called the British Raj. And ruling India profited Great Britain because it was a market for British manufactured goods and also a source of raw materials such as cotton, which I mentioned before, indigo, which is a dye, and a product known as jute. And if you take a look at uh, the image here down at the bottom right hand corner, jute is basically the material that you use to make burlap. Ram Mohan Roy. He was an Indian nationalist. Matter of fact, he lived during the latter part of the 1700s into the beginning of the 1800s. But he believed that Indians should have the same rights as Europeans. He was one of these individuals who was kind of working for the British East India Company. And he was watching how Indian money was literally draining out of this part of the world and going back to Europe. And he started keeping track of that. At the same time, he was also working for the British, so he kind of had a little insight of what was going on. At one point in time, he is sent to Great Britain, and he kind of lobbies politicians there. He also supported some of the legislation that the British called for, like the banning of the sati. But at the same time, he was one of the first voices to call for independence. Number 11, the effects of the Swadeshi boycott movement, which is was a movement to bring back home rule, meaning that the people of India would rule themselves, but also to have people buy products that were made in India, not to buy British-made goods. This movement, as far as the effects, were to convince the British to make concessions to the Indian people, and led to the formation of what was called the Muslim League. The Muslim League was a group of, obviously, Muslim men who basically were calling for home rule at different points in time. British rule of India was beneficial because it helped build railroads, roads, and canals, but it harmed India in that it devastated India's pre-existing industries and kept India from participating in government. Thank you very much.